No incident marked the beginning. That was the first inconsistency. Procedures changed before anything happened. Meetings shortened. Access tightened. People spoke more carefully, not because they had been warned, but because they sensed alignment shifting. I looked for the trigger and found none. No breach. No failure. No public mistake. Just behavior adjusting in advance of an event that hadn't occurred. That's when I realized this wasn't a response. It was anticipation. Someone had acted as if the future was already known. That knowledge hadn't been shared, but its effects had. Fear had become proactive. And proactive fear doesn't wait for proof. It moves on probability. I watched teams restructure around an absence that didn't exist yet. Contingencies drafted for scenarios no one could articulate. Language softened preemptively. That's when systems reveal their most dangerous instinct. They don't wait to be wrong. They act to avoid being surprised. Episode 7 didn't begin with damage. It began with preparation. And preparation, when it's not justified by reality, tells you someone believes the outcome is already decided. I stopped looking for evidence and started tracking confidence. That's always the tell. When people don't know, they hesitate. When they've been warned, they panic. But when someone knows, they move smoothly. Too smoothly. Decisions arrive fully formed. Contingencies feel rehearsed. I noticed it in one person first. Not the loudest. Not the highest ranking. The one who never asked clarifying questions. He already knew which ones were unnecessary. While others debated possibilities, he narrowed outcomes. While teams speculated, he redirected resources. Not urgently. Casually. As if the future had already happened somewhere he'd seen it. I began mapping his movements against the adjustments happening around the organization. The alignment was too precise to be coincidence. He wasn't responding to change. He was pacing it. That's when the question shifted. Not what are people afraid of, but who decided fear was appropriate. I listened carefully to how he spoke. No predictions. No warnings. Just statements framed as practicality. We should probably avoid that. That won't age well. Better to get ahead of it. He never explained why. He didn't need to. Explanations invite challenge. Confidence doesn't. I tested him indirectly. I raised a hypothetical that mirrored the adjustments already in motion. He didn't bite. He corrected the framing before answering. Subtle. Efficient. He wasn't thinking about whether the scenario would happen. He was thinking about how people would react when it did. That distinction matters. It told me he wasn't speculating. He was calibrating. I watched how others responded to him. They didn't defer openly. They aligned quietly. Decisions shifted after his input, not because he demanded it, but because his certainty removed friction. That's how influence works when authority wants to stay invisible. I realized then that whatever people were preparing for hadn't spread as information. It had spread as posture. Tone. Pace. The future wasn't being discussed. It was being assumed. That assumption had a source. I followed the trail backward and found nothing official. No directive. No memo. No meeting where this future had been named. That's when it became clear. Someone had seen something early enough to shape response without triggering protocol. That kind of foresight is dangerous. Not because it's wrong, but because it bypasses verification. I asked myself whether this person was acting responsibly or manipulatively. The answer was uncomfortable. Both. Responsibility can become manipulation when it isn't shared. I noticed how he avoided certain spaces now. Rooms where questions lingered. Conversations that hadn't yet synchronized with the new posture. He didn't correct them. He let them lag behind. That lag created pressure. Pressure accelerates alignment. I watched teams adjust without understanding why they were adjusting. That's when fear becomes systemic. Not because something is wrong, but because not adjusting feels risky. I confronted him indirectly, not about the future, but about timing. I asked why changes were happening before any trigger. He smiled, just briefly. Not defensive. Amused. Because reacting late is worse than reacting wrong, he said. That sentence landed heavier than anything else. It explained everything. The system wasn't afraid of being incorrect. It was afraid of being surprised. Someone had internalized that fear deeply enough to act on it without permission. I realized then that episode 7 wasn't about a hidden event. It was about preemptive governance. Power exercised not in response to reality, but in anticipation of it. I understood the danger immediately. When anticipation replaces evidence, there's no moment to intervene. By the time proof arrives, behavior has already hardened around expectation. The future becomes self-fulfilling. I noticed how quickly dissent evaporated in this environment. Not because people disagreed less, but because disagreement required a future they no longer believed in. That belief had been quietly edited. Someone had rewritten probability in advance. I watched him leave a meeting early once. Nothing unusual. But the meeting concluded 5 minutes later anyway. Momentum followed him out. That's when I knew. He wasn't managing reaction. He was managing inevitability. Episode 7 had crossed its true threshold. The system wasn't preparing for something that might happen. It was preparing for something it had already decided would. And when a system decides the future in advance, the present becomes a formality. The most dangerous part wasn't that people were afraid. It was that they felt relieved someone else had already done the worrying for them. That relief is how control becomes invisible. And it meant the next part wouldn't be about uncovering what was coming. It would be about discovering who gave themselves permission to decide first. The language changed before the rules did. That was the first measurable shift. People stopped asking what happened and started asking how likely it was to happen again. Probability entered conversations as a substitute for fact. It sounded reasonable. Responsible, even. But probability doesn't need proof. It only needs agreement. And agreement spreads faster than evidence ever could. I noticed decisions being justified by phrases that felt technical but explained nothing. Risk-adjusted. Forward-looking. Statistically unfavorable. None of these terms referenced reality. They referenced expectation. That's when I understood the transition. Evidence had lost its authority. Probability had replaced it. Once that happens, the future becomes actionable before the present can object. I watched a proposal get rejected not because it failed, but because it might. The reasoning wasn't flawed. It was premature. Prematurity is powerful because it can't be disproven. You can't argue against what hasn't happened yet. You can only seem reckless for trying. I saw people adapt quickly. They framed ideas in ways that minimized exposure rather than maximized truth. That adaptation wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Systems reward those who align with anticipated outcomes. I began tracking how often probability was invoked without source. No model cited. No data shared. Just a shared sense of inevitability. That sense didn't originate from analysis. It originated from posture. The same person from part 2 continued to move ahead of discussion, setting tone before content arrived. He wasn't presenting forecasts. He was normalizing expectation. Once expectation feels common, dissent feels irresponsible. That's the mechanism. I tested it by asking for evidence. Not confrontationally. Casually. The response was immediate and revealing. We don't have time to wait for certainty. Certainty had been reframed as delay. Delay as risk. Risk as failure. The chain was airtight. Evidence was now a liability. I realized then that the system had entered a new mode. It wasn't managing truth. It was managing tempo. Faster decisions meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant fewer opportunities for contradiction. Probability allows speed without accountability. If the future doesn't arrive as expected, the decision can be explained as reasonable at the time. That's how responsibility dissolves retroactively. I watched people who once valued precision now prioritize alignment. They weren't dishonest. They were practical. Practicality had become the highest virtue. I noticed how meetings ended earlier. Conclusions reached faster. That efficiency was celebrated. No one asked what had been lost. Loss is invisible when nothing has technically gone wrong yet. I thought back to earlier episodes, to memory being treated as a liability. Now memory wasn't even required. Probability bypassed it entirely. You didn't need to remember the past if you could predict the future convincingly enough. That realization unsettled me. Prediction doesn't require continuity. It only requires confidence. Confidence had become the currency here. And confidence, once rewarded, reproduces itself. I watched junior staff mirror the posture of senior ones, speaking in terms of likelihood rather than fact. They learned quickly which phrases granted them safety. If this continues, assuming current trends, based on emerging signals, none of these needed verification. They sounded analytical. That was enough. I realized then that episode 7 wasn't about someone knowing the future. It was about someone deciding it. Probability had given cover to authority without disclosure. Whoever set the initial expectation didn't need to be right. They only needed others to act as if they were. That collective action would then produce the outcome being anticipated. The future was being engineered through consensus, not discovery. I felt the danger sharpen. Once probability replaces evidence, there is no moment where intervention feels justified. Everything can be explained as precaution. Every restriction framed as responsibility. I watched a project be quietly dismantled not because it failed, but because its success introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty had become the enemy. Predictability was safer than progress. That's when I understood how far this had gone. The system no longer responded to reality. It responded to forecasts of discomfort. Someone had taught it to fear surprise more than error. I realized then that the next phase wouldn't involve debate or exposure. Debate requires facts. Exposure requires proof. This phase would involve momentum. Once probability governs action, reversal becomes almost impossible. Changing course would require admitting that decisions had been made without sufficient cause. Systems don't do that voluntarily. They accelerate instead. I watched acceleration take hold. Timelines compressed. Options narrowed. Language hardened. The future began to feel heavier, closer, unavoidable. That feeling wasn't organic. It had been cultivated. Episode 7 had revealed its core threat. Not a hidden event. Not secret knowledge. But a system that had learned to act on expectation alone. And when expectation becomes policy, the present loses its right to object. Speed changed everything. Not visibly at first. No one announced accelerated timelines or demanded faster conclusions. The pace simply increased until hesitation became noticeable. Decisions arrived pre-framed. Options narrowed before discussion could expand. By the time someone considered objecting, the moment had passed. Objection requires space. Space had been engineered out. I realized then that this wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. Acting quickly wasn't a side effect of urgency. It was the strategy itself. Speed prevents dissent not by silencing it, but by outrunning it. I watched how proposals moved now. They entered meetings already aligned with assumed outcomes. Alternatives were technically present, but structurally irrelevant. They existed to demonstrate openness, not to influence direction. That's when I understood the shift. The system had learned to move before resistance could coalesce. Resistance needs time to recognize itself. Without time, discomfort remains private. I noticed how often people said, "We can revisit this later." Later never arrived. Later is a concept systems use to defer accountability indefinitely. I tracked how often this phrase appeared and how rarely it resulted in reversal. Speed had created a one-way flow. Once momentum established itself, stopping felt disruptive. No one wanted to be responsible for slowing things down. That's how collective pressure forms without instruction. I tested this by raising a concern slightly out of sequence. Not confrontational. Just mistimed. The reaction was immediate. Not defensive. Impatient. "We'll note it," someone said, already moving on. My concern didn't vanish. It became administrative. Logged, but not engaged. That's the difference between acknowledgement and consideration. Speed allows acknowledgement without consequence. I realized then that acting before objection wasn't reckless. It was protective. The system protected itself from doubt by making doubt inefficient. Doubt that can't keep up doesn't threaten direction. I watched people internalize this quickly. They stopped voicing uncertainty not because they lacked it, but because uncertainty slowed things down. Slowing things down had become socially costly. That cost wasn't enforced. It was felt. I saw it in how often people apologized for asking questions. Just one quick thing. Questions had been reframed as interruptions. Interruptions are unwelcome when momentum is valued above clarity. I noticed how the person from earlier episodes navigated this environment flawlessly. He never rushed, yet he was never behind. He anticipated the next step just early enough to shape it. That's the advantage of acting before objection. If you define the frame early, objections must operate within it. They lose their leverage. I realized then that this phase wasn't about hiding information. It was about compressing time. Time compression eliminates reflection. Without reflection, people mistake motion for progress. I watched a significant decision pass through with minimal discussion. Not because it was obvious, but because discussion would have required slowing the schedule. The schedule had become untouchable. I felt the pressure to adapt intensify. Not externally. Internally. I caught myself preparing thoughts faster, simplifying concerns, editing complexity before it could surface. That self-editing wasn't imposed. It was learned. Speed had become the environment's dominant value. I thought back to how evidence had been replaced by probability. Now probability was being replaced by inevitability. If something was assumed likely, it was treated as imminent. If imminent, it required immediate action. Immediate action leaves no room for objection. The chain was complete. I realized then how systems transition from caution to control without ever appearing forceful. They accelerate. They move faster than ethics can respond. I watched how people rationalized this internally. At least we're proactive. Proactivity sounds virtuous. But proactive action without evidence is just unchallenged assumption in motion. I understood then that episode 7 wasn't escalating toward exposure. It was accelerating toward irreversibility. Once decisions pile up faster than they can be questioned, they create a structure too dense to dismantle. No single choice appears fatal. Together, they lock direction in place. I felt the narrowing path ahead. Objecting now wouldn't stop the process. It would only mark me as someone who couldn't keep pace. And pace, not truth, had become the measure of competence. I realized the danger wasn't that someone had acted early. It was that the system had learned to prefer action over understanding. Once that preference settles, the future no longer waits to be proven. It arrives by default. Episode 7 was no longer about anticipation. It was about momentum. And momentum, once established, doesn't ask permission. It carries everyone forward, including those who still feel something is wrong but no longer know where to slow down enough to say it. The first time I noticed it, it wasn't framed as concern. It was curiosity. Someone asked why a review was taking longer than expected. Not accusingly. Casually. As if time itself had become a variable worth monitoring. That question lingered longer than it should have. It wasn't about the delay. It was about deviation. Slowing down had started to register as an anomaly. In a system optimized for acceleration, anything that resists pace feels hostile. I watched how pauses were reinterpreted. Reflection became hesitation. Hesitation became risk. Risk became something that needed to be managed. That's how suspicion forms without intent. No one declared that slowing down was wrong. They simply began treating it as something that required explanation. Explanations are burdens. People avoid burdens when speed is rewarded. I noticed how often people preemptively justified their timing. Just to be thorough. Only double-checking. These disclaimers weren't necessary before. Now they were automatic. Time had become something you needed permission to use. I tested this by deliberately slowing a process that didn't require urgency. Nothing broke. But the reaction was immediate. Not reprimand. Attention. Attention can be more dangerous than punishment. Questions followed. Clarifications requested. Updates expected. The slower something moved, the more visible it became. Visibility invites oversight. Oversight invites control. I realized then that speed wasn't just valued. It was protective. Moving quickly kept you out of focus. Slowing down placed you under a lens. I watched how people adapted. They stopped asking whether something needed to be fast and started asking how to make it appear fast. Perception mattered more than reality. Deadlines were met by narrowing scope. Concerns were deferred in the name of momentum. No one wanted to be the reason things paused. Pause had become a signal. Not of care, but of friction. I noticed how the person who seemed to know the future reacted to this shift. He never rushed, but he never slowed the group either. He moved with the pace, not ahead of it. That's the safest position. To appear aligned with acceleration while quietly shaping direction. Slowing down openly would have drawn suspicion. Speed had become a loyalty test. I began to understand the deeper implication. Once slowing down is suspect, there's no space left for doubt. Doubt requires pause. Without pause, doubt has nowhere to exist. It remains internal, unspoken, unresolved. That's how systems produce compliance without demanding it. People don't stop thinking critically. They stop finding time to express it. I watched a moment where someone almost objected. You could see it in their posture. A breath taken, then released. The objection died before forming. The conversation moved on. Later, that person justified their silence by telling themselves they'd revisit it later. Later never came. That's how silence reproduces itself. I realized then that this wasn't about silencing dissent. It was about making dissent inefficient. Inefficiency carries stigma in accelerated environments. No one wants to be inefficient. I felt the pressure myself. Thoughts that would have once become questions now dissolved into internal notes. I told myself I'd raise them if necessary. Necessity never arrived because everything kept moving. I saw how easily this could become permanent. Once pace defines competence, anyone who slows the system appears incompetent by default. That framing is powerful. It delegitimizes caution without arguing against it. I thought back to earlier episodes, to memory being sidelined, to probability replacing evidence. This was the final layer. Time itself had been weaponized. Not by shortening it, but by moralizing it. Fast was good. Slow was suspicious. I noticed how even silence took on a different meaning. Silence during fast movement looked like agreement. There was no time to distinguish consent from inability to interject. That ambiguity favored momentum. I realized then that the system no longer needed consensus. It needed continuity. As long as movement continued, alignment was assumed. I asked myself what would happen if someone deliberately slowed things down now. Not as protest, but as process. The answer was clear. They wouldn't be punished. They'd be scrutinized. Scrutiny erodes trust. Trust, once eroded, isolates. Isolation makes further slowing impossible. The system had closed the loop. I understood then that episode 7 wasn't approaching a dramatic reveal. It was approaching a quiet lock-in. Once slowing down becomes suspicious, reversal becomes unthinkable. Everything that follows will be justified as keeping up. The future won't arrive because it's correct. It will arrive because nothing was allowed to stop it. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all felt while it was happening. It didn't announce itself as resistance. It arrived as delay that couldn't be compressed. A dependency that refused optimization. A process that required sequence, not acceleration. At first, it was treated like an inconvenience, something to be routed around. But you can't route around a prerequisite without acknowledging it exists. That acknowledgement was the crack. Everything else had learned to move faster. This hadn't. And the system noticed immediately. Not with anger. With unease. Unease is what systems feel when momentum meets friction it can't reframe. I watched the language adjust again. People stopped saying, "We'll push through," and started saying, "We'll monitor." Monitoring is what you do when pressure stops working. The thing that wouldn't speed up wasn't dramatic. It wasn't human, and that made it worse. Humans can be persuaded, replaced, or reclassified. This was structural. It demanded order. It demanded verification. It demanded time. Time had become the one resource the system could no longer spend. I saw attempts to abstract it away. Summaries offered instead of steps. Checklists instead of review. None of it worked. The process required attention in sequence. You couldn't skip ahead without breaking it. Breaking it would be visible. Visibility is dangerous when speed is the virtue. I noticed how meetings began circling this issue without naming it. Everyone knew what was slowing things down, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Naming creates obligation. Obligation slows everything else. So the system did what it always does first, it tried to relocate responsibility. Who owned the delay? Ownership is how blame is prepared. But ownership didn't stick. The delay belonged to the structure, not to a person. That's when irritation surfaced, not openly, but in tone. Shorter sentences. Tighter deadlines elsewhere, as if compensating. The system tried to outrun the delay by accelerating everything around it. That worked for a while. Then the gap widened. The faster everything else moved, the more obvious the stationary point became. It stood out by contrast. I realized then why this moment mattered. It wasn't about the delay itself. It was about proof. Proof that not everything could be made to move on command. Proof that some things resist probability, anticipation, and pressure. The system doesn't fear slowness. It fears limits. Limits imply boundaries. Boundaries imply accountability. Accountability requires explanation. Explanation requires truth. I watched the person who had been shaping expectation react to this obstacle. He didn't dismiss it. He reframed it. He spoke about sequencing, dependencies, acceptable lag. He tried to fold the delay into narrative. That worked briefly. Narratives are flexible. Reality isn't. The process still didn't speed up. Each attempt to compress it introduced errors that had to be corrected later. Correction costs time. Time the system had already spent. I felt the tension sharpen. This was the first moment in episode 7 where acceleration met something it couldn't intimidate. The system began searching for alternatives. Parallelization. Outsourcing. Anything that could restore motion. But every alternative required validation by the same immovable process. That's how you know you found a true constraint. You can't escape it by rerouting. You have to confront it. Confrontation was the one thing the system had avoided all episode. I noticed how people reacted individually. Some grew anxious. Anxiety pushes compliance. Others grew quiet. Quietness preserves distance. A few grew frustrated, not with the delay, but with the fact that it exposed the illusion of control. Control had been assumed, not tested. Now it was being tested. I asked myself what would happen if the system acknowledged the limit openly. The answer was immediate. It would have to slow down everywhere else to maintain coherence. That would unravel the moral structure built around speed. Speed had been framed as competence. Slowing would look like failure. The system couldn't accept that. I realized then that the next move wouldn't target the process. It would target perception of it. If you can't make something faster, you make it less central. You redefine importance. I saw early signs of that shift. The delay was described as edge case. Non-critical. Temporary. Language prepares removal long before action occurs. But removal wasn't possible here. The process wasn't optional. It was foundational. That's what made it dangerous. Foundational things don't go away quietly. They force reckoning. Episode 7 had reached its inflection point. For the first time, anticipation, probability, and speed had encountered something they couldn't override. The system hadn't lost control yet. But it had discovered something it couldn't command. And when systems discover limits, they don't slow down to reflect. They look for someone to hold responsible for the existence of the limit itself. Blame didn't arrive as accusation. That would have been too obvious. Too human. Instead, it emerged as alignment. A gradual convergence of language, focus, and attention toward a single point of friction. The system didn't ask who was responsible for the limit. It asked who was closest to it. Proximity became implication. The immovable process hadn't failed. It had simply refused to accelerate. That refusal needed interpretation. Interpretation needs a subject. I watched how discussion subtly reframed the issue. Not, why can't this move faster, but why is this still central? Centrality is negotiable. Limits are not. The system chose the negotiable option. I noticed how references shifted from the process itself to those associated with maintaining it. Their names appeared more frequently in summaries, always neutrally, always factually. Neutral repetition is how focus is established without accusation. Over time, the association became self-evident. No one needed to say it out loud. Responsibility had been redistributed. Not assigned. Redistributed. That's the cleanest form of blame. I saw how the person nearest the limit reacted. Not defensively. With confusion first, then realization. Confusion is the natural response when nothing has technically gone wrong. There were no errors to correct. No policies violated. Just an emerging consensus that something, or someone, was slowing things down. That consensus didn't require evidence. It only required momentum elsewhere. I watched how the system resolved the tension without touching the limit itself. The process remained. It had to. But it was repositioned. Rescoped. Its outputs delayed, deprioritized, buffered by layers of abstraction. The system didn't eliminate the constraint. It isolated its effects. And isolation always needs a boundary. Boundaries need guardians. Guardians become bottlenecks. Bottlenecks attract scrutiny. I realized then that the limit hadn't been blamed directly. It had been made inconvenient. And inconvenience always finds a caretaker. I noticed how people spoke differently to those now positioned as caretakers. Still polite. Still professional. But expectations changed. Patience thinned. Updates demanded. Justifications required. Time had become something they needed to defend. That defense drained energy. Energy that could have been used elsewhere. This is how systems exhaust what they can't remove. Not through force, but through load. I asked myself whether this was intentional. The answer didn't matter. Systems don't need intent to function effectively. They only need patterns that reproduce themselves. The pattern here was clear. Limits don't disappear. They get managed by people. Those people become the problem. I watched normalization settle in again. The rest of the system adjusted. Speed resumed around the isolated constraint. Conversations flowed without referencing it. Relief returned. That relief was telling. It meant the discomfort had been relocated successfully. I understood then that episode 7 wasn't about someone making a wrong call or hiding information. It was about how systems respond when confronted with something they cannot optimize. They don't adapt themselves. They adapt around the limit and assign the cost to whoever remains closest to it. The future moved forward, lighter, cleaner. The past remained contained. The present felt stable again. Stability is always convincing. It persuades people that the solution worked. I considered whether anyone would remember how the limit had surfaced in the first place. They would remember it abstractly, if at all. As a phase. A delay. A complication that had been resolved. Not by elimination, but by reorganization. That's how responsibility fades. It doesn't vanish. It gets diluted across structure until no single decision can be challenged. I realized then that the system hadn't avoided blame. It had perfected it. Blame without accusation. Responsibility without error. Consequence without conflict. Episode 7 ended not with a reveal, but with a demonstration. Systems don't fear limits. They fear being slowed by them. And when they can't remove a limit, they make someone else carry it quietly. The most unsettling part wasn't that this worked. It was how reasonable it all felt once calm returned. No one felt guilty. No one felt attacked. Everyone felt relieved. And that relief ensured the lesson would stick. The system would remember what to do next time. Long before anyone else noticed the limit forming again.